everybody, it's Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini. I'm in my studio and we are working on the last video of our La Family Quilt Along series here, where we're going to finish up the quilt blocks, lay them out on the design wall, and piece them all together to create the finished quilt top. All right, so we're here at my design wall, and a lot of people will always ask what I have up here to be a design wall. This is a really inexpensive and quick way to do it. I set this up several years ago with what I had on hand. So this is just a piece of 100% polyester batting, and I simply push pinned it right into the drywall of my studio, which is quick and easy, and it's fine. It works for me. Some people may not want to do that in their house, so there are other ways of doing it, but this is how I do it. So we're at the design wall. We're going to grab our blocks. You should have 10 blocks of each of 2 different designs. So we're going to start doing the layout. Because we have 20 blocks, I designed this quilt to be 4 blocks across by 5 blocks down. That's going to give you a rectangular quilt, which is typically what we go for. I'm going to start with one of these blocks and make sure that you're orienting it the same way as I am here. And I just smooth it on. That's how it sticks to the batting. Real simple. Then I'll grab one of the other blocks, put it next to it. Then we'll alternate and go back to this one. And then one more of these. So it's just one of each of the blocks alternating. Super simple and a great way to lay out your blocks so you can see what you're working with before you start to sew them together. So I'm going to go ahead and do the full layout, and then I'll show you what it looks like before we piece it together. All right, so you can see the finished design layout here. Remember, the grid is 4 blocks across by 5 down, so you should have a total of 20. Now we're going to go to the sewing machine and take these over as rows, or whatever your preferred method is to piecing the blocks together. Just make sure that you take your time and double check to make sure that you're grabbing the correct block before you sew it together. So we're going to sew these together in rows. I like to do row 1 and row 2, and then I'll combine them to create basically a small little quilt top that's made up of 8 blocks total. And then I'll do the same technique, but separately with the remaining 3 rows, and put those together into a big chunk made up of 12 blocks. So then I'll basically sew them together across this seam here, where it'll put together the top 8 and the bottom 12, and that will put all 20 of the blocks together to create the quilt top. Now each one of these blocks is designed to finish in the quilt top 12 inches square. What that means is that when it's by itself like this, it should measure 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches. You have an additional 1/2 inch seam allowance on the sides and on the top and bottom, because that will then be taken up when you sew to the blocks that are on either side and on the top and bottom of the block. Does that make sense? So individually, the block should measure 12.5 by 12.5 inches, and in the finished quilt, it will measure 12 inches by 12 inches. So when you see a pattern tell you that finished, the block measures whatever, finished means inside the quilt top already pieced in there. So right now, let's grab a couple of these blocks. I'm going to head over to the work table, measure them to make sure that they're the 12.5 inches that they should be. And if they're not, I'll share with you some tips and tricks on how you can make all your blocks be the same size, so that when you get to sewing them all together into the quilt top, you have really nice points at the intersections and everything matches up, so it'll make sewing the quilt top together a little bit easier. Here's one of my blocks, and the quickest and easiest way to make sure that they measure 12.5 inches square is to have a handy 12.5 inch square ruler. So if I place this right on top, you can see that it's pretty spot on. There's a little bit extra sticking out because I like to sew my blocks together with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that looks good to me. I won't even bother trimming those up because it's barely anything. And then I'll put it on the next block. And on this one, I can see I have just a little bit sticking out here, and the rest looks pretty good. So if it's not too much, I know that I can, just sew them together and work with those little bitty threads. But if you had a block that was way bigger, then that tells me that your seam allowance was a little bit too small than what it should be. So you need to find a consistent seam allowance so your blocks turn out consistent, right? Now, if the block is way smaller, which is mostly going to be the case for a lot of beginners, I find that those 1/4 inch piecing feet that a lot of companies sell for their machines are exactly a 1/4 inch. So it doesn't account for the thread and the fold of the fabric after we press the seam allowance in one direction. So after all that, you end up having a seam that's way bigger than 1/4 of an inch. So I don't like to use those feet on my machine. Instead, I go narrower than the 1/4 inch so that by the time the thread thickness is accounted for in the stitch and this folding of the fabric when you press the seam over, I'm then at 1/4 of an inch, if that makes sense. So if your block is too small, that means your seam allowance was way too chunky. And it's okay if your block finish is smaller than the 12.5 inches square. The key thing for this quilt in particular is going to be that they be consistent, because all the blocks are made identical. They're all made up of 9 individual blocks, okay? Even the pieced one here, they're all 9 patch units. Then what you want is all your blocks to be the same size, regardless of the finish size they are. If they're all the same size here individually, meaning you still sewed a consistent whatever seam allowance, if it was bigger than 1/4 of an inch, as long as all of them were sewn the same, then the quilt is still going to come together as it should. The problem starts when you have some blocks that are bigger, some that are 12.5, some that are smaller. When you have that situation, that tells me that you're either not cutting very precisely your individual patchwork units, or that each one of your seam allowances is off, meaning you're not sewing consistently straight following a specific guide. So if you have that, what you need to do is get all your blocks together, find the smallest block, measure it, and then you're going to trim all the other ones down to that size. You have to trim them down to the smallest, otherwise that little one won't fit in, right? It won't match up with any of the other larger blocks. So whenever you have different size blocks, cut them down to whatever the smallest size is, okay? Find the smallest block. And then from there on, you'd move on with piecing the quilt top together in rows, just as we're going to continue to do here. So now I'm going to start grabbing my blocks so I can piece them together. So I'm going to sew this one to this one to this one to this one. And I'm just going to take the stack over because I know that the first one needs to be sewn to the second, then to the third, and the fourth. So as long as you come up with any way that is comfortable for you to kind of orient the blocks and know which one gets sewn where, then you're going to be good to go. I have a few other different methods, but I think for this, especially if you're a beginner, this is probably going to be a simple way to do it. Just do them in rows individually, and then we'll combine them into separate chunks. All right, so as you can see, you always want to press after you sew. So I sewed all these seams together of each block to make one row. Then I went ahead and pressed them open. Remember, it's easier to kind of force the fabric to have them abut at the intersecting points. And then if I have to move the seam allowance in one direction to make it kind of pucker up on me a little bit, when I'm pressing, I just go in with some sharp snips and I just cut into the seam allowance and allow half of it, one side of it, to lie flat on one side, and then at the seam intersection, I can have it going towards the side that I did to get that intersecting point. That's a little bit kind of tricky to understand, I think, but if you see it, I think it'll make more sense, especially when it happens to you, then you'll know what it is that you need to do so that you can fix it and get those seams to lie flat. So here's row number 1. All my intersections look beautiful from block to block and from row to row. So that looks great. Okay, which definitely helps if you're consistent cutting and if you're sewing with a consistent seam allowance, okay? Now we're going to do the same thing to the second row, and then the third, and then the fourth, and the fifth. And so if you want at this point, if that was pretty easy for you, just go ahead and pull all the stacks the same way that I did. If I found that it wasn't confusing, I can just sew them up all at the same time, which is what I'm going to do, and then I will meet you back here once the different sections are completed so you can see the finished quilt top. All right, we're back at the design wall. I've pieced together all of the 5 individual rows. They're standing alone like this. I haven't yet connected them into the different chunks, But I wanted also to share something here. For beginners, I like you to just go methodically and step by step, grab each block and piece together the rows. However, as you become a more intermediate and advanced quilter, you'll start to find patterns and things that you can do that will help simplify the piecing process. And here's one of them. And it's easier for you to see now after it's done. So you see how the rows, we alternated the blocks, one with just the regular 9-patch block and one with the green, and alternating it like that. Well, look what happens if I flip this row over. You'll see that it is the identical row to the one above it. Do you see how it is exactly the same? So if you made 5 of the exact same oriented blocks in the same orientation of the block and put together in the same format that we have here, all you have to do is flip over every other row to get that kind of staggered look with the green blocks. Does that make sense? So these 2 rows now are identical, and then they're identical now with the 3rd one. The 4th one needs to be swapped over, and then they will all match. So let me just flip this one back. And so that's one easy way to just get the staggered block design. And it's also another way for you to double check your work to make sure that you had each block correctly before you sewed it together into the rows. So now I'm going to take these top 2 rows and sew them together across here. Then I'll place them back up on the design wall, and then I'll come down here and grab 1, 2, and 3 rows, okay, and sew them together to make a bigger chunk. And I'll meet you back here once that is done so you can see how I separate them into 2 chunks. And then the last seam that we have to sew, we'll combine the entire quilt top, and it's just going to be right along here. All right, so here are our 2 chunks, top 2 rows, bottom 3 rows. Now we just connect the 2, and we will be done with our entire quilt top. So that's what I'm going to grab now and go over to my sewing machine to sew it up together. And here is the finished La Family quilt top. When it's done and you prepare it, with your batting and the backing and whatever your binding is going to be, the finished quilt should measure at that point about 48 inches across by 60 inches down. Right now, because we still have added seam allowance here and here, because we haven't quilted it or attached the binding, it should measure about 48.5 inches by 60.5 inches, because you're going to take up a 1/4 inch here and here when you go ahead to attach the binding. Now, there are so many different ways that you can finish a quilt top. For those that are unfamiliar with what a quilt actually is, this part that we've pieced together here with all these blocks is just one layer of our quilt. And this is what we call the quilt top. Then behind that goes the batting, which is what adds the fluff and the warmth to it. There's so many different kinds of battings on the market. And then behind that will go another layer of fabric, which can be one solid piece, or it can be pieced together any way that you want to. So that's what we call a quilt sandwich. The quilt top, then the batting, and then the backing fabric. Then when you make the quilt sandwich, you get to the point where you're going to quilt it. And quilting is 2 different things that oftentimes get beginner confused. It's the art of quilting, so all of the stuff that I was doing to put this quilt together is called quilting. But when you get down to the quilt sandwich and you have your layers, the quilting that you need to do at that point refers to what type of stitching or technique you're going to use to hold all 3 layers of that quilt sandwich together. So we put all 3 layers together and then we stitch through it somehow to keep them together. And so you can do that on machine, you can do that on a long arm quilting machine, on your domestic sewing machine. You can also do it by hand with hand quilting stitches, or you can also just tie the quilt. And I've already done videos showing all those different techniques. And so what I'm going to do is leave you with a link in the description box below. And on that page on my website, you'll see different links for different ways on how you can finish your quilt, okay? So I hope you all enjoyed this video tutorial series of how to make La Family quilt along with my kinfolk fabric for Timeless Treasures Fabrics. And if you enjoyed it, go ahead and hit this video with a thumbs up below, share it across the different social media sites, and of course, if you want more video tutorials and you don't want to miss out on the new projects that are coming, make sure to click the subscribe button on my channel so you don't miss out. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.